Some of you heard us mention CADA, Coalition Against Death Alley. We, Justice and Beyond, is part of that coalition that is fighting against the petrochemical industries that are continuing to murder and poison people along the river between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. This poster right here is part of our fundraising campaign. We need to sell at least 5 of these on tonight. They're $20 a piece. This is a poster of Grandma and the baby. Grandma is trying to survive in her neighborhood and live and thrive and have clean water, clean soil, clean air. But she can't do that because a very bad neighbor has moved in. That is the petrochemical industry that is behind her, that is taking the life from Grandma and her grandbaby each and every day. So we are consistently fighting against these petrochemical industries, and you're standing with us. So just let Sylvia know there are 5 people in this room tonight. They're going to buy 5 posters. I believe it, and I feel it. I don't know who they are, but you're going to buy 5 posters tonight. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for your support. So if you agree to operate by peace, love, and respect, just say that. Say, I will. If you won't, say, I won't. Then we are good. All right, we're going to go ahead. Indeed, there are so many issues with sewage and water board that we need to get organized to fight against. They almost seem overwhelming, but if we stand united and we don't continue to sweep the issues under the rug, and as long as we bring them to the surface and say we won't ignore that they're there and doing damage and threatening the quality of life of the people of New Orleans, then we can fight this thing and do something about it. One of those issues is lead in the water. Sewage and Water Board refuses to admit that there is any harmful degree of lead in the water, but we know, and at least I hope you know, that any amount of lead in the water is too much lead in the water. And we can do something about that. So tonight we have a panel that is going to both bring forward the issue and why we need to fight and why we need to bring this issue to light, and also give some reasonable solutions or actions to what we need to do. And that question is also for us as well too. How do we get organized to bring this to the surface and make sure that it is not continuing to harm, especially our children and elderly within New Orleans? So with no further ado, I'm excited to have Brother Kone, who is helping to facilitate this discussion with our panelists here, who was my partner in crime, was behind me when I went to jail. And only reason he went is because he tried to hold him back. And so I just am forever indebted, and it was such a calming for me to see you walking into jail behind me. And so thank you for being there and what you did. All right, panelists, if we just begin with introducing yourselves, we'll start here to my left and go on down, and then we'll finish with Mr. Kone, and Kone will conduct the discussion. Please, to my left.
Deborah Campbell.
Everybody, please use the microphone.
Deborah Campbell. I'm the Upper Ninth Ward chairperson for A Community Voice. And we are here tonight to discuss Sewage and Water Board and a lawsuit that's in place for them.
Good evening, y'all. Pepper Russell, founding director of Culinaria Center for Food Law, Policy, and Culture.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to have time for comments in just a little bit after our panel gets done presenting. Also, too, if you have comments or questions, please write them down on the index cards that are located next to or inside of buckets to the right of the stage. And is there one to the left over there too? And to the left of the stage. At any time, please fill out one of those, because our panelists will be open to answering questions, but they must come in this form. Write them down on the index card, print them so that we can read your sometimes illegible handwriting, print them very clearly so that we can read them, and then if you want to ask the question yourself, write your name on it. If you don't care whether you ask the question, then don't write your name on it. When you do ask the question, you get this mic, you got exactly 90 seconds to ask that question. Or we're going to use this rope right here to pull it back. All right, exactly 90 seconds if you ask it yourself. All right, I'm sorry. Please continue with introductions.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Katner. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Public Health and Environmental and Occupational Health at LSU Health Sciences Center.
And I am Kone, and after that glowing presentation done by Reverend Manning, on my behalf, I am practically speechless and do not know if I can carry on with this endeavor. However, I will give it my best shot. I want to take this opportunity to welcome each and every one of you all here to the world-famous Cafe Istanbul in the Healing Center right here on St. Claude Avenue. And tonight we are going to, at this portion of the program, going to be discussing the issue of the Sewage and Water Board and the lead, the controversy of the lead situation. I want to thank my panelists for making time to participate. Ms. Deborah Campbell, Dr. Adrienne Katner, and Ms. Pepper Roussel. Hopefully I enunciated all your names correctly. And I'm not embarrassed to be corrected, okay? So feel free. My mama brought me up right. Okay, so moving right along to the list of questions here. What I'd like to first do is to share a fantasy that I have. This is the fantasy, okay? This is preliminary to the actual discussion. Okay, I looked at the list of the members of the Sewage and Water Board, the Sewage and Water Board. I looked at the list and the position that each member of the board held. And I was particularly astonished to find two people that ought to be here. Well, actually, the whole board ought to be here. But two in particular, and these two individuals listed are Alejandra Guzman. She is a consumer and community advocate on the board, Sewage and Water Board. The other individual is Joe Pechard, also listed as a consumer and community advocate on the Sewage and Water Board. Will these two individuals please stand and join us on the stage, because you ought to be up here. Where I'll dial. Okay. All right, well, that sort of speaks for itself. I'm curious, I can't help but to think, how did these people, who supposedly purportedly represent the community, how did they get on the Sewage and Water Board? Did they just volunteer and say, I'm a community representative? Did they get appointed? As we go along, hopefully some of our panelists could share you all's observation as to those two individuals, if you know any of the folks that specifically on the Sewage and Water Board. Okay, that said, I'd like to open it up now to the panelists with my first question. And my first question is, what is lead? All right, it's in two parts. And we're just walking through the basics to set the foundation here. What is lead? The source or the sources of lead.
Lead is a heavy metal, and it's naturally occurring, but it persists in the environment forever, basically. In terms of water, the source of lead is from plumbing. Biggest source of lead in water is from lead service lines, which New Orleans has all over the city. But there's also lead in brass faucet fixtures and other, and lead solder that's in your premise plumbing.
Anyone else care to respond as to lead? What is it and the sources of it?
Lead comes from a lot of different places that you probably would not expect. There's lead found in car batteries. There's lead that's found in crystal. So if anybody remembers registering for lead crystal, that's not just for funsies. It's actual lead. It's also found in some cans, imports. There's at one time there was lead that was found notoriously found in paint. It has been removed from gas that is for automobiles, but it's still permitted in airplane or airline. Yeah, so it's found in a lot of different places. It's really about the concentration, because it's not that you will never, and so I defer to a scientist because that's not who I am. It's not that you'll ever be able to get away from lead. We cannot remove lead, but what can happen is that you diminish the exposure to lead, the consumption of lead.
All right, thank you all, panelists. Can lead be removed? Well, first of all, before I ask that question, how does lead get into its sources that you all have mentioned into the human body? How is that facilitated?
With regards to water, you drink it. That's an easy one. Water is the biggest source, especially for children who are being fed with formula that's reconstituted with tap water. Children who are exploring their world with their hands and mouths often get it through ingestion or inhalation of soil when they're playing, also active children, but also through the peeling of paint, old paint. Prior to, what was it, 1986, there was a certain amount of lead allowed into paint. It's still allowed in commercial paints, but not in residential paints. But it tastes very sweet, and so if you have a really bright old paint on your wall, sometimes they'll explore it, and if they like it, they'll start eating it. That's another big source. Food is one source that's really been unrecognized until lately. EPA has come out and said food is a big source of lead in our diet. Did I miss anything? Toys, teething toys.
Yeah, yeah.
We've found it in toys that are imported.
Well, so when folks think about children, for instance, eating paint chips, you think of a child who's just sitting and peeling it off of like old walls, and that's not necessarily the case. As Dr. Katner mentioned, the paint was permitted, right, to have lead in it until, I mean, not too terrible, within all of our lifetimes, right? There are still a number of ways that it becomes airborne and you can ingest it. If there is somebody who is sanding the side of the house, right, it then becomes airborne, but it's got to go somewhere. So ordinarily it just settles into the soil, and when you track through it, it can end up at the bottom of your shoes, and then if you don't remove your shoes before you enter the house, it ends up on the floor in the house. And so curious children, pets, they're all very they touch a lot of things, and then from their hands into their mouths, right? So it happens in a lot of different ways. In fact, the way that Dr. Katner and I met was my question about what happens to the food that we either grow here or we wash in water that has lead or other heavy metals. And that's a super big question that we don't necessarily have an answer to, but how you get it inside of yourself is some sort of consumption.
Thank you. Once lead gets into the human body, what happens? How does it manifest itself?
So in children absorb lead a lot better than adults, and it goes to the brain. It impacts just about every organ system in the body, but for developing children, what we're most concerned about is their exposure can cause developmental problems, cognitive delays, attention deficit disorders, educational problems, depression, a lot of different things. So for adults, it's very subtle. you know, these are things that we see in New Orleans children everywhere. And so it's not easy to recognize, oh, that person must be lead poisoned. You really have to kind of bring that child to the doctor to have their blood lead levels checked. And then that is really only an indicator of what they were exposed to recently.
Oh, what does it do to your body? All right, so lead is a bioaccumulative metal, so you don't get rid of it, right? So even if you go on a diet or you work out a lot, it just kind of stays in there. For African Americans, this is particularly harmful because for whatever reason, African Americans absorb lead much more efficiently, much better than other races, and so it then gets put into the bloodstreams, and you can see those aggression issues and the inattentiveness, impulse control disorders that are also indicators or symptoms of other diseases or conditions or even disorders is the word I'm looking for, that we have a tendency to medicate children for. And often, especially in African American children, when the child does not respond to the medication, they are labeled as incorrigible or morally failed, right? So if you have a child who has been misdiagnosed as being having ADHD, and when in fact this child has bioaccumulated lead for whatever, however it is that they got it, I pass no judgments, what ends up happening is that child ends up on the school to prison pipeline that much faster. For adults, it does, there have been a lot of studies that have connected to livers and kidneys. Reproductive outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, the list is very long.
Yeah,
but that is a big concern, reproductive outcomes in women, and especially women, because you're bioaccumulating it throughout your whole life, the chances of you exposing your fetus are very high. It can travel through the placenta, cross, you know, there's no blood-brain barrier at this point, it's still developing. So it's a very, that's the biggest point of concern right there. Reproductive outcomes, you know, we're still learning about, at the very lowest levels that you can detect in water, in blood, we're seeing reproductive outcomes. So this is something that we need to, you know, be aware of. A lot of women don't know that you can accumulate this in your body throughout your life.
Can I interject a question real quick? Are children and adults, especially children in schools, being routinely tested for lead poisoning?
No. You have to ask the pediatrician to test them. Okay. The state of Louisiana.
The state of Louisiana started requiring 2 tests, 2 screenings before the age of 5. I've talked to pediatricians that work at LSU that didn't even know that that was a requirement. We actually did a survey of New Orleans pediatricians who didn't think lead was a problem anymore. The problem with it is you usually, you know, the mother has to ask for the screening. And this is something that, you know, Medicare will pay for. And it should be provided at year 1 is when you want to do it, at the beginning. And if they have a problem, then you can look at the sources that they might be exposed to and sort of weed through them. Yeah, there's a problem.
Thank you.
My concern is in minorities, it's mostly overexposure to lead. For some reason, the housing that we are provided with for rental purposes, they have high levels of lead in their fixtures and all. So that's one of the reasons that I think minorities are higher risk for lead poisoning. Another thing, I'm the mother of an autistic son, 35 years old, and I wonder if the lead in what he had to come up with, or the lead that I passed on to him through my pregnancy, could have contributed to his autism. Because they are saying brain damage, and they are saying ADHD, which is closely related. So all of this comes into effect as far as I'm concerned. And we need to get to the bottom of it so that we can clear out these lead lines in the city so that we can start to heal what damage has been done to us and our children. A lot of deaths. We're not sure what's going on with our consumption of water and vegetables, well, mainly vegetables, that the water is spread on, that could cause some of these deaths that we're not sure why it happened. A lot of organs are affected by it. You know, they tell us we are diabetic. Then is the pancreas being affected by the lead? So all of this has come into play, and that's my concern.
Thank you. Ms. Roussel mentioned that once lead is in the human body, it cannot be removed. Is that correct?
There is a half-life of lead in blood of about a month. The half-life of lead, it usually goes into the bone, to hard tissues like the teeth, the bones. That half-life is, I believe, it's 20 years. So what that means is it's going to take you decades to remove that lead. And that is a concern because as you get older, your bones start to break down, you're starting to leach that back out. And now they're looking at studies at early life exposures and later life cognitive problems like dementia. So these are early studies. We don't have, the facts yet, but this is a problem that we're considering now. There's like two peaks for people, basically, when you're a child because you absorb it so well. And then when you're a pregnant woman, because you start to leach it out as your fetus needs more calcium. And then in menopause and as you start aging, when it starts to leach out of your bones.
Okay, thank you again. How does one live after being lead poisoned? How does one live with that, or does one live with it?
Most people who have been exposed to lead poisoning or lead contamination don't know, which is why it's so important. So to back up 2 steps, we do have screenings in the state of Louisiana for children. Those screenings come really, really early. If you are either a parent who is not necessarily looking for lead poisoning, the markers may not be something that will trigger a panic for you. If you have a pediatrician who does not think that lead poisoning is a problem, it may be more difficult in order for you to get the blood lead level testing done, because even though there is a reimbursement, even though they can be paid for it, it's not necessarily something that is considered emergent or something that we really, really, really need to pay close attention to, like diphtheria or measles shots or your chicken pox, right? It's something that it feels very, very nebulous, very out there, very existential, like climate change. It's coming, but we don't necessarily feel it in this particular doctor visit today. As you get older and you start exhibiting, or the child starts exhibiting delays or issues with being still, those can also be attributed to other things. It's not until much later or something that's extreme that you will even begin to start thinking about having your blood tested, which is why getting blood lead level tests is so incredibly important. In broad strokes, once the neurological damage is done, it is simply done. So to make sure that the infants, that the children, as they're entering school, are tested is the only way that you're going to know, is by having the tests done.
I'll just add that there is no treatment for lead poisoning. All you can do is ameliorate the problems. So there's education that you can do. There's things you can eat to reduce your exposure, to increase your excretion, but there is no treatment, and there's no safe level.
Okay, unfortunately, I have to ask this question. You know, some folks may say, well, duh. Well, that's okay, I'm willing to take that chance. But does everyone agree, what do I mean everyone? Scientists, researchers, political leaders, business and corporation, do they all agree that lead is bad for you?
Scientists now agree. So the CDC has acknowledged in 2012 no safe level of lead exposure. Even the lowest levels that we can measure in blood has some significant impact that we can measure. Now, not a lot of people have caught up with that. Public health practitioners, medical providers aren't really cognizant of the latest developments in the science literature. And unfortunately, scientists, we don't do a really good job of communicating these issues to the public. And so it's still getting out there. So we're still getting that information out to the public and to political representatives and healthcare providers. This is very important that it gets out to them too.
Can I say something to introduce something?
Yes.
When you say about testing and the mother have to be the one to ask for the test, well now, far as medical coding, it's a whole thing that goes back to generations. For instance, I graduated, got the ICD-9, but ICD-10 is more thorough. ICD-10 goes back to the genetic. So the mother shouldn't have to ask. It's already being set in place by the government that this have to take place. When you go in for a certain procedure, if it's genetic, they got to research all the way back. They got to give you all those testing. So when they say the mother have to ask for this, not with ICD-10. You don't. It's thorough.
Well, so the ICD-10 is for billing, right? So any physician, when they do something, they use this code in order to get money back from Medicaid or Medicare or insurance.
Listen to what I'm saying. It's a history.
Right, I understand
So
what you're
it's
saying.
to detect all the bogus charges they used to give us, pull people out the project. They
Right.
can't do that no longer. So if it's a history and my genetics of lead poisoning, breast cancer, or whatever, those tests are now covered under that one doctor's visit.
Yes, they are covered.
Right.
They are covered, but they are not necessarily performed, which is the distinction here, right? So yes, they can get money for it. Yes, they can bill for it. Yes, they can get paid for doing the test. But yes, you as a person who is going into the doctor's office has to advocate for yourself and to demand that the test is done. The screenings that happen really early. So those are before the child enters school. By the time the child enters school, I repeat, it can be explained in a lot of different ways. Oh, it's a little boy and he can't keep still, or oh, he's an only child, or he's got a missing father and so he's acting out. Whatever the reason is that you decide to figure out at 5 years old why this kid has dysgraphia, or the mother didn't spend enough time with him, he's not learning quickly enough because nobody read to him at bedtime. There are probably other reasons that can be all put underneath the umbrella of environmental injustice. However, when it comes down to whether the child will be tested for lead poisoning, that is a specific ask, right? So even if they do take the blood, right, so, or something more universal, when you go and you, like say for instance, you are having an annual and you have to pee in a cup, they don't necessarily test you for pregnancy. They don't necessarily test you for anything that you aren't there for, right? So, although I do think they do test for pregnancy each time. Yes. So, they don't, maybe they're not testing for something else, right? So make sure, it's not gonna hurt you. It's not gonna hurt you to say, hey, you know what? I've seen something that might be a little different, or, you know, I'm here, if you're drawing blood anyways, you're testing for my cholesterol, you're testing for my blood sugar, test for lead. Just make sure, I know you can bill for it. It's not gonna hurt anything. The blood is already drawn. It's another test that can simply happen.
All right, thank you again.
And let me just say this too, and you might be getting to this, Courtney, but this letter specifically that describes the lawsuit that A Community Voice and Justice and Beyond are involved with against Sewage and Water Board due to the levels of lead in the water. It says quite a disturbing statement, I believe, in the preamble of the first paragraph, it talks about that our lead level is worse than Flint, Michigan. Is that, could that possibly be true?
So what happened after Flint's water changed, the proportion of children that were tested increased from 2 to 4%. At that same time, New Orleans, the proportion of children who were tested who had elevated blood lead levels was 5%. It's between 5 and 7%. And so we have a higher proportion of lead poisoned children than Flint did, even at the crisis level.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, I'm going to mention 3 entities, and I'd like the panel to respond as to, from their observation, research, readings, communication, what the response of these 3 entities are to the accusation of lead poisoning. Those 3 entities are the Sewage and Water Board, the city government, and the local media. What is the official response from each? And in describing their official response, what evidence do they present?
That's a loaded question. The Sewage and Water Board, I have to say that the former Cedric Grant, the former executive director, was not willing to work with us. It seems like there is some changes happening with the current Sewage and Water Board, but I haven't, I have requested for information on where the maps for the lead service lines are, and have still to this day not gotten them. So there's still some issues with communication and with transparency there that I wish would work. But the fact that healthcare providers are a little, a decade behind what we know now as scientists, you can imagine that, people that work at the Sewage and Water Board don't think lead is an issue. My dad was the director of the Sewage and Water Board, and I asked him, I said, Dad, why didn't anyone do anything about this? At the time, they don't know. They're not educated about that. These are water quality engineers. This is not their field. The city, I've also come under, I've come under fire from the city as well. They were not happy with my work, and so I've been, excommunicated. Because it sounds like I'm trying to wake people's awareness up about this issue. This is one of the easiest things you can take care of. It doesn't cost as much as remediating paint or even soil. You can get a $15 filter, $20 filter. We are testing filters right now. This is really something that's very easy to take care of in terms of just exposure, reducing your exposure in water. Third person?
Media.
Media has been on my side, is always on my side. I was a little taken back by why there wasn't a lot of media coverage about the fact that the prior New Orleans Office Inspector General put out a report with really amazing evidence showing that that the sampling done by the Sewage and Water Board is completely, it's inaccurate. It's not done in the manner that is required by the EPA, and so it can underestimate the amount of lead. This came out. It actually came out 2 years ago. The New Orleans Office of the new New Orleans Office of Inspector General did not release it. The former Inspector General actually released it in December. No media about this, nothing in the news. It just came out on BuzzFeed and then it disappeared. I don't know why. I think, Trump is it was bumped by Trump maybe. I don't know. It wasn't sexy at the time. So, but I do have to say that they have been very responsive.
The local media. Even though the local media, even though they have, if I understand you correctly, they haven't publicized it, the local media, have it? Local? I know BuzzFeed is not local, right?
Well, the Office of Inspector General report, the one, yeah, that one I did approach some media people and no one took it. And I think it was wrong. This really needed to come out and people needed to be aware of this report. And the fact that it was not released to the public was rather shocking to me.
We did have news media at several locations for schools. They did show up. We had Nolan Marshall helped us with the schools, and we did wind up with some filters put in place in some of the schools in the city.
So, if you think back, right, to the things that you might have heard on the news, every now and again you'll hear about Dr. Howard Milkey and his lead research. You'll hear about Dr. Adrian Katner and how there are elevated levels of lead in the water. You'll hear about a school somewhere in town or out somewhere in the state that's found elevated levels of lead. The media does cover it. It just doesn't stay in the forefront because of, the news cycle. It's not sexy. It's one of those things that happens.
Yeah.
To the panel, panelists, to the best of your ability, your assessment, your observation, your experience, from research, from studies, etc. What areas, what community, what neighborhoods of New Orleans are the lead pipes located in?
Well, I would like to answer that, and I've actually requested the data for that, but I've still not received it. So one of the things that Beth has really tried to help me with is put in those, those Public Records Act requests to get that information. I'm still waiting for the information. Something may have come to you guys that when I was away, but from my experience, it's all over the city. I was under the delusion that, well, maybe New Orleans East is fine, because what happened was they started to ban lead pipes in 1986. But lo and behold, I found very high lead in the water out in New Orleans East. So really, this whole thing of, oh, New Orleans stopped using it in 1950, I have found no documentation or evidence to support that, nor did the Inspector General's office. So what I firmly believe is that it was used up until the time it was banned in 1986. In fact, my sister's house, who had one of the earliest, if you look, you can find a map online about when the service line was installed. It gives you an actual year. Based on that, my sister should not have had a lead service line because her house was created after 1986, but she did. I don't know what that means, but so it tells me that it's been used all over the city.
Brother Cornet, in 2 minutes, we have to move towards questions from the audience, so you want to...
Okay, well, what I'd like to do then is get to solutions. Solutions from the panelists. How is this what seems to be a monumental issue, and you all have undertaken it in your own ways? What are the solutions to the issue of lead poisoning in New Orleans?
Everyone says, oh, just remove the lead service line. Well, that's actually not a good idea. If you're only moving half of the lead service line, what's called a partial, the EPA Advisory Board determined that this is very dangerous and it may not necessarily help. You need to remove the entire line, but you could still also have some lead in your premise plumbing. What I advise people to do, instead of spending thousands of dollars on that, is to get a filter and to remember to replace your filter cartridge, as it says on the box.
The filter itself will give you an indication of when it's no longer working, so that you can replace it.
So from a legal perspective, the EPA has moved a little bit slower than the CDC. Additionally, in the state of Louisiana, we have a threshold that's over twice as much, 3 times as much actually. It's at 15, and it should be under 5 or 0. And so trying to get to a place where we can adjust the laws so that a little bit faster, a little bit more efficiently, so that they do reflect best scientific information, best practice, and best scientific available information.
Okay, I want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists. You guys have been extremely informative, And at this time, what we'd like to do is entertain questions from the gathering. Is that correct, Reverend Matt?
That is correct. We have some here. I know that Ms. Pepper Roussel has to go. And so please, audience, please join me in showing our gratitude for Ms. Roussel. Thank you, and thank you for your time. Other panelists, if you please stay where you are, and we're going to get to these questions that we have here. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the buckets to the left and to the right of the stage. And remember, at this time, if you have written your name at the top of the index card, we'll call on you to ask the question. You have 90 seconds to ask that question.
Thank you, Pastor. First, I'm going to start with Mr. Richard. Mr. Richard, come ask your question. Your name on the call.
Okay. Well, actually, I have one on filters, though, since you just talked about that. I think New Jersey had a problem recently. And I'm speaking loud. But I noted, I actually looked into that. I looked onto the website that the people in New Jersey were seeing, what the community, because they were worried, because even with the filters, they started having problems for some people. And there was speculation it was because people had the hot water turned on at the faucet when they were using the filter. That was one of the speculations. Yeah. But no, let me finish. Okay. We're getting so hot here for so long. You know, I mean, it's August and September now, and I've noticed that the water coming out of my spigot is probably in the 80s, and that might be an issue. But but that wasn't the question that I had on the card. I'm
really glad you brought that up, because this was a concern of ours.
Leaching.
Yeah, after what happened in Flint, when we started seeing breakthrough of high lead levels through filters. And so that's why we're doing the study in the field, to evaluate when these filters work and under what conditions. So there's a lot of towns, rural towns in Louisiana, that have high iron and high manganese. And what we found is it's going to clog. It's not going to work. And you might see spikes and breakthroughs in the filters. So what we're trying to figure out is, under what conditions will the filter work? New Orleans, the lead levels that I see here, these filters are going to work. When the very cities that have very, very high lead levels, like we saw in Flint and we saw in Newark, New Jersey, it says on the filter that there's a break point. If you have over this amount of lead in your water, these may not work. And that's when the utility needs to start dealing and treating the water appropriately. But in New Orleans, what the levels I see here are low enough so that I'm very confident these will work. We're still waiting for the results for New Orleans, but we have the results so far for Enterprise, Louisiana. They're fine, but they're not perfect.
But the aspect of leaching, for instance, if your filter is 2.5 months.
Mr. Richard, you have 30 seconds.
2.5 months into the 3 month, say you have a 3-month period, and somebody turns on the hot water, might that leach out the lead that's been caught by the filter in that 2.5 months, and then all of a sudden you have a surge?
Yeah, that definitely can happen. Now, you're supposed to replace that filter cartridge every 2 or 3 months. Right. And it may be more frequently if you have a lot of people in your home that are using the faucet a lot. If you don't have a lot of people in the home, it may be less than that. But these are details we're trying to figure out in the field. Right now, faucet filters only get tested in the lab under very controlled conditions. Well, that's not how we use it. So we're trying to find that out now. Again, this is the first test that's ever been done on filters in the field.
Okay, on the issue of solution, there's been some proposals. One that I've heard, it probably will not be popular in this crowd, is to privatize the Sewage and Water Board. That's one solution that I heard. All right, let me mention a couple of others. Mass mandatory testing of everyone in New Orleans. And a third possible solution, a lawsuit.
All right, we're going to move to that solution section in just a minute as we get through with these questions, Brother Kone. So we're going to get through with these questions first, and we're going to move to action time. All right.
Mr. Richard,
Okay.
Would you like for me to ask these other two questions?
Yeah, and I have one on the back, but real quick.
Okay, well, I'm gonna ask your one and move to the next.
Okay.
He asks, do we have lead main lines in New Orleans?
Um,
Are they like the 6-inch lines?
Those are galvanized iron. Actually, the Historic Society just found a wooden main in the French Quarter. My dad told me, I remember hearing about that, we use that. But no, we don't have lead mains.
Okay. Ms. Darlene?
Those of us in New Orleans are used to boil water advisories, and you think if you boil the water, it's gonna make everything go away. So if you boil the water, will it boil the lead out?
No, that only kills the microbes.
Okay, thank you. The next one says, we have learned recently that dementia and possibly Alzheimer's can be a result of lead poisoning, correct?
There is evidence suggesting that early life exposure and later life re-entry of the lead from the bone as it decays into the blood is associated with dementia and Alzheimer's. There's still more evidence that we need to collect on that. We don't have solid base of evidence right now, but it appears that that is likely.
Thank you. Does lead stored and found in an expectant mother cause death in overweight of a 9-month potentially healthy child?
Yes, this is the field that I'm most concerned about, is the reproductive outcomes. Even if a woman, doesn't have high lead in her blood, once she becomes pregnant, lead acts a lot like calcium, and when you're pregnant, the child will absorb that because it thinks it's calcium. And so what we're concerned about is your lifetime exposure and then leaching it into your fetus, where it will go to the brain and cause problems. So yeah, it can cause spontaneous abortions.
Thank you. The next one is,
Not at this time, but wait, was that your question?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Pastor. The reason I had asked that question, this is what happened to my family this weekend. The baby was living, normal heartbeat, and then the doctor said, well, we're gonna take the baby because it's not coming on its own. And when we went to, prepare, they said, no heartbeat. We didn't get alarmed, with what he said, and we had to see what God said, but God took, let the baby go in heaven. But anyway, what I'm saying, the baby was 12 pounds. And with this discussion and the discussion of the family, I have an idea that it had to be something intake, because the mother health is fraud, etc. But I'm waiting on this autopsy.
It could have been exposure by the child from the mother, from what she's been accumulating in her body. Unfortunately, as Deborah knows, it's so hard to determine what's the cause. That's a big question.
Sorry, our condolences to you and your family.
yes, we're
for
very
praying.
sorry.
Sorry to hear
Yes,
that.
Jesus. Mr. Peter?
Yeah, I was just curious, all children under Medicaid must receive an early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment exam on a regular recurrent basis. Is lead screening included in the EPSDT exams in Louisiana or not? And if not, it would certainly be useful to do.
I believe Medicaid children do a better job, the providers do a better job of screening Medicaid children. I don't have any stats on that, however. Again, some doctors aren't aware that they're required to do that. They're required to test at 1, and I believe it's at 3 or 5. If they do find a high blood lead over 5, they're supposed to do follow-up testing and interview the the mother or father to see what the source might be and to try to rule it out.
Thank you. Sunny? You want me to add? Okay. Is there any way locals can see the actual levels of lead and what is the current percentage of lead in our water?
Yes, you can request the data from the Sewage and Water Board. I have it, so I'll happily share it with you. And I mean, it should be transparent. Actually, there's revisions in the EPA's lead and copper rule to make those data transparent and available to the public. So I'm hoping that that is soon approved. And also, you can also get the information online through the EPA's Safe Drinking Water Information System, or SIDWIS. Again, that was the Safe Drinking Water Information System. You can find the lead levels. Also, the DEQ, Louisiana DEQ, has that information also available. The database was down when I last looked. I don't know what's going on there.
So a couple of questions, follow-up questions to that. Number one is it a way to, because I'm still on this Flint issue and how our water level, our levels of lead is greater than Flint. Is there a way to put out some statistics that show these up against each other so that people can clearly see that, especially Sewage and Water Board, so that it's right in front of their face instead of just saying it? You can see that in those numbers.
So the problem is with what is the source of those? Why do we have a higher percentage of children that have higher lead? It could be the soil, it could be the paint, it could be the water, it could be the toys, it could be a lot of other things. So we can't pinpoint and say it's the water. Okay. Our water lead levels are lower than what Flint saw. I mean, they saw levels, you know, up to 20,000 parts per billion. And what I'm seeing in Louisiana is between, you know, 1 and 10 mostly. I checked my water and I had 30, which was way above the, you know, double of the action level. I didn't even think to test it. I live out in Gentilly and I thought, maybe a newer home, you know. No, it's everywhere. So it's very hard to do that.
Okay, all right.
And the next part to the first question was, and what is a way that Sewage and Water Board can treat the water?
They are supposed to use anti-corrosion inhibitors, orthophosphate. And what that does is it creates a scale on the inside lining of the lead service line, and that prevents that lead from leaching. As it gets hotter, the lead will leach more. When they go in and they start doing their work, they're taking out these lead service lines, they'll only take out what they own, which is from the meter to the main. They don't take out your side. And what that does is it actually can jar the lead service lines physically and remove some of that inner scale that then gets stuck into your premise, your home plumbing, which can become a long sort of endogenous source of lead over time. And that can create these spikes for weeks to months to even years, the EPA said. So that is what they're supposed to do with the orthophosphate, and that is why, you know, that scale, leaving that scale on is so important.
Okay, Mr. Capasso? Okay.
I actually remember to ask that.
90 seconds, Mr.
Have you
Davis.
seen any in the United States or around the world of a top model for removal of lead and also testing? And do you see this as a possible, maybe a workforce could be created for lead removal, creating jobs because of it?
Yeah, I think there are some model studies. I believe one was Madison, Wisconsin, where they've already removed 100% of their lead service lines. Don't quote me on that. I have to recheck it, because I haven't looked at that. But I believe it was Madison, Wisconsin. And they came up with some very inventive financial schemes to create the money, you know, by selling billboards. I mean, just things like that to create the money to actually allow them to replace all of the lead service lines, the owners and the, the other side.
And Dr. Kettner, I might be wrong, but doesn't our present executive director of Sewage and Water Board come from Madison, Wisconsin? Milwaukee. Okay, so, yeah. All right, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. We do have a rural water infrastructure committee that's supposed to deal with these things. I wasn't asked to be on it. So they are trying to deal, actually, New Orleans, we're doing pretty well with our water quality compared to these rural areas like St. Joseph and Enterprise that are really struggling and that have really bad water quality. We're talking about frequent boil water alerts all the time, problems with iron, problems with manganese, problems with Legionella, problems with other bacteria. We don't have that kind of a problem. We're very lucky. And so I think what the government is trying to do, what communities are trying to do is, how do we afford this? And then what are we replacing it with? Are we going to come in and replace it with plastic? And now we're learning a lot about the plastic lines. What is the best type of plastic? Is it polyvinyl chloride? Is it something else? We're starting to learn about that. And so we might want to just wait, I say, until we learn more about the impacts of the other materials. And so that's why I talk about filters, because it's cheap, it's easy, you can have it now. There's all kinds of things in our water that we don't test for. I mean, our drinking water is from the Mississippi River. The Safe Drinking Water Act was actually created because of the organic chemicals that were found in New Orleans drinking water. And a lot of those things we don't test for. That's why I push filters, whether it's this one or reverse osmosis or whatever you can afford, because you want to make sure that the water you're drinking and you're cooking with is clean.
The next one is Mr. Ben. He asks, what is the connection of lead to Alzheimer's?
Well, actually, you answered that previously, I think, but there's a fine line between dementia and Alzheimer's. And in your initial opening statements, you mentioned dementia specifically, not Alzheimer's. And you used to say Alzheimer's was caused by aluminum. Now I don't think they say that anymore. So maybe I can clarify that you can refine the answer.
So I was born in the 70s when lead exposures were at their peak in America. So I have a little cognitive issue. So I don't always say everything that it might be related to. But what we're learning is it's cognitive problems in the elderly, which we, are natural. That's what we keep saying. They're natural. You do. You will lose your cognitive abilities as you age. What does it do to? That's a whole nother question that we're just trying to really learn.
And just one addition to that, also in the Mississippi River, you mentioned that we get all those farms, big commercial farms. There's a lot of use pesticides, and those pesticides are heavy metals, right?
A lot of the pesticides are organics. Yeah, and we don't test for all of them, so that's a problem, and that's why I keep pushing. Get a filter if you can afford it, whatever type. I think it will help. It will go a long way to help reducing your exposure to these chemicals that we don't even test for.
I wanted to ask, with the filters, how clean is the water from the lead once you put the filter on?
So what we've seen is a 98% reduction in New Orleans from the ones that the data have come out for so far. And we've actually seen about 98% reduction in St. Joseph. In St. Joseph, though, they only last a month or two, sometimes a week, because they have such high particulate levels in the water. So it's not going to be a good solution for them. In New Orleans, the ones where the data have come back so far, it looks like it does a really good job of reducing it. What we're doing, the data still isn't out, but what we did was we actually ran the filter way past its lifetime, the time where you're supposed to change the cartridge, because that's what everyone does.
Yes.
I do it. Yeah. No one remembers, unless you have that more expensive version that has the light, you just forget, or you can't remember when you last changed it. So we're going to be testing that, and hopefully we'll have the results of that soon. I'd be happy to come back and demonstrate or present those results to you guys.
Thank you, because the reason why I asked, noticing in a lot of the filters you have like those cold pieces that collects the deposits and stuff. So to me, it's still like poison still there.
Yeah, this is the very first field study of these filters. You do see some carbon come out. What you want to do is when you first get that filter cartridge, you want to run the water through that cartridge for about 5 minutes, a good 5 minutes with cold water. You don't want to use hot water with your filter. You want to always use cold water, always cold water. It's just better for lead, for metals, and other things that might be in your premise plumbing to reduce that.
Let's move to action now, Brother Kone, because this conversation could be a little depressing if we did not realize our power to do something about it. So, firstly, you take power by getting the filter. Secondly, we take power by doing some other action. So, Brother Kone?
Yes, just to reiterate, solutions that I've heard from different people, I've mentioned them, I just will reiterate them. In relationship to the Sewage and Water Board, that's talk about, well, you know, business does it better. Why not privatize the Sewage and Water Board? That's one solution that is being bantered about. Another, mandatory testing of the residents of New Orleans, or if not all the residents, those areas that are determined to have the higher lead levels. And the third solution that I've been hearing from many people is that a class action lawsuit ought to happen in order to get action.
The first solution you mentioned, privatize, I don't know if you have anything to say about that. I'm not for it. I think this is a community good, and you know, we need to be able to have transparency and oversight in the community over our water utility. And if it was private, I don't know if we would have that kind of power. As far as the second solution, which was
Mass mandatory
testing, I don't.
Or at least in a higher.
Right, I think testing is essential in schools, but I am not a proponent of continual testing. I think it's a waste of resources. I think you should spend the money in schools on filters that we can know work. What happens with testing is, because it's primarily in New Orleans, what you see is not a dissolved lead, it's a particulate lead that comes from the scale, that comes from the leaching from the premise plumbing. And what that means is that you're going to get these spikes all the time. So you could test your water and it'll be very low one day, and you could test that same tap and it'll be very high another day. So I don't think testing is good. Having said that, we are doing some tests of the little tests that you can buy at Lowe's and Home Depot to see what their limitations are. At least it can give you some, some indication of whether you might have lead. And the third, yeah. So we do use them. They're not really good, those water testing kits for particulate lead. But what we're now testing is if we just use a little bit of lemon or vinegar in the beginning of the test, we're trying to see if that actually dissolves the particulate so we get a better detection.